Every weapon has a weak spot. With Russian artillery, it isn't the barrel itself, not the crew, not the ammunition. It's something you only understand once you know how Russia actually builds these guns in the first place. That's exactly where Ukraine struck. 250 times, in 2 nights. And the staggering part isn't even the number. The staggering part is that Moscow can't undo this damage anymore. And that is what becomes the Kremlin's real problem in the weeks ahead. To grasp what really happened in those 2 nights, you have to understand what the Russian war is actually built on. Russia doesn't win its battles with finesse, it wins them with mass, and no weapon stands for that mass like artillery. Stalin himself called it the god of war. Over the past 3 years, that god has turned entire Ukrainian cities into dust, and that's not just a figure of speech. In this war, Russian artillery has taken more ground than any other branch, not by capturing positions, but by making them unlivable. First came days of fire. Then the infantry walked in and occupied whatever was left. A brutal but effective method. You don't have to storm a city if you've already leveled it to the ground. That's exactly why Russian artillery was for 3 years the real engine of Russia's advances. Where it fell silent, the front stood still. Where it spoke, the front moved meter by meter, ruin by ruin. Think of Bakhmut. Think of Avdiivka. By the end, those weren't battles for houses anymore, but for piles of rubble. When Russian infantry couldn't break a position, they did it differently. They called in the fire. And the fire simply erased the place house by house, trench by trench, until there was nothing left to defend. You can picture it like a hammer. Drones, tanks, assault squads, that's the hand. But the artillery is the hammer itself. It's what lands the blow at the end. And for years, Russia simply had more of that hammer. On some sectors, the Russian side fired several times what Ukraine could fire back. Where Kyiv had 1 shell, Moscow had 5, sometimes 10. That wasn't a question of courage or tactics. That was pure math, and the math was on Russia's side. Anyone who remembers the images from 2023 knows how that felt. Back then, the Ukrainian side spoke openly of shell hunger. Soldiers described rationing their few rounds, while on the other side, the fire rolled on for hours without pause. Ukraine has caught up a lot since then, with Western ammunition with its own production, and above all with drones that have flipped the script in many places. But with classic tube artillery, the gap remained. Russia could simply keep more steel in the air, and that lead was for 3 years perhaps the single most stable constant of the entire war. Everything else changed the front line, the weapons, the allies. Russia's fire superiority stayed. That superiority came at a price not for Russia but for the people on the other side. According to Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, on some sectors of the front, more than 10% of all Ukrainian casualties trace back to a single branch of arms Russian artillery. On the most contested stretches, it's as high as 20%. Read that twice. 1 in 5 Ukrainian soldiers who falls there falls to a barrel that often stands kilometers away, one he never even lays eyes on. That's what makes artillery so feared. It is death without a face. No duel, no warning, no enemy you can see or fight back against, just a whistle in the air, and the next moment, the impact. For 3 years, that whistle was the soundtrack of the war, and it almost always came from the same direction from Russian barrels that could fire more, and for longer than anything Ukraine could put up against them. That's the uncomfortable truth of this war. You can ground Russia's air force, you can set its tanks on fire, you can take out its generals, but as long as those guns keep firing, the front keeps bleeding. They are the metronome this whole war beats to. And here lies the problem Ukraine broke its teeth on for 3 years. Silencing those barrels was almost impossible. You could hit them, and 2 days later they were back firing again. It was like knocking out an opponent who gets up every single time. For 3 years, that opponent kept getting up. You blackened his eye, broke his nose, put him on the canvas, and by morning he was back in the ring. Ukraine tried everything to crack this one advantage. It hunted the guns with reconnaissance drones, struck their positions with precision rocket launchers, sent FPV drones into the firing pits, and it hit them. Again and again. It just never lasted long enough. Russian artillery works on a simple principle: fire and vanish at once. Shoot, roll, and drive off before the answer arrives. And even when a hit landed, the gun went to the workshop and came back. It was a game without end. You cleared the table and it filled itself back up. Until those 2 nights, because this time Kyiv says the opponent doesn't get back up. But before we get there, hold on to one thing. Buried in Fedorov's words is a detail almost everyone missed, and it isn't the number 250. It's the reason a single destroyed gun barrel hits Russia harder than a whole burned-out tank. And that reason has almost nothing to do with the battlefield. It has to do with 4 factories, and with the metal, Russia has to import from abroad. We'll come back to it. And then all of it suddenly makes sense. It wasn't a press conference, and it wasn't an official briefing. Fedorov let it drop almost in passing in an interview on the YouTube show Pressing, produced together with Armia Media. That casualness is exactly what makes it interesting. He didn't talk like someone selling something, but like someone confirming something. The core of what he said: Ukraine had developed a special projectile that destroys the barrels of Russian artillery. In just 2 nights, 250 Russian guns had been knocked out with it. And then the line Ukrainian media seized on at once: for every single case, there is video confirmation. That's the consistent reporting from United 24 Media, Euromaidan Press, and the news agency Interfax Ukraine. A word of honesty here because it belongs in the story. So far, this is the statement of one minister. 250 is Kyiv's number, not that of an independent source. The alleged videos are, as of today, not publicly verifiable case by case. So we tell this story exactly as it is, as what the Ukrainian side claims, cleanly backed in the reporting, but not yet independently confirmed. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it at the end because it decides whether this is a turning point or just a strong headline. The name of the operation sounds like a joke at first, Artyom. And in a way, it is one, because it's the sequel to something that already happened once. Last year, there was an operation called Oshan, named after a supermarket chain. The mockery behind it: Ukraine cleared out Russian hardware the way a discount store clears its shelves in a closing down sale. And the numbers were brutal. According to Fedorov, Ukraine sent in roughly 1,000 drones over 3 nights and destroyed around 800 Russian armored vehicles. The effect was so devastating that Moscow couldn't launch a major armored offensive for half a year afterward. 6 months of breathing room bought in 3 nights. And Artyom doesn't stand alone. In the same interview, Fedorov painted the picture of an entire drone doctrine squeezing the air out of Russia in several places at once. He spoke of occupied Crimea being increasingly cut off by constant drone strikes. The supply routes, he said, have become so dangerous that the peninsula is, in his words, practically turning into an island. He mentioned additional funding for so-called middle-strike drones meant to hit Russian logistics command posts and supplies deep in the rear at depths of 20 to 300 kilometers. And he stressed that in the first 4 months of this year, Ukraine had procured more drones than in all of the previous year. That's the context Artyom belongs to. It isn't a single stroke of genius. It's one tile in a strategy that no longer asks how to beat Russia in the field, but how to knock the tools out of its hand piece by piece. Artyom is nothing other than the same idea with a new target. ART stands for artillery. Instead of clearing tanks off the shelves this time, Ukraine is clearing out the guns. The same script, the same handwriting aimed at the one branch of arms Russia can least afford to lose. But why does it work now of all times when almost nothing worked for 3 years? Fedorov supplied the answer himself, and it's the key to the whole thing. The problem had never been hitting a gun, he said in essence. The problem had been keeping it dead. An FPV drone, a fragment, a hit from above that damages a gun. But the Russians dragged the damaged guns to the workshop, patched them up, and pushed them back to the front. The damage was almost always repairable. The new munition makes exactly that one step impossible. It doesn't damage the gun somewhere. It destroys the one part you can't repair in the field. And that brings us to the detail I asked you to keep in mind. Listen closely, because this is the part most channels skip. A gun is made of many parts. The carriage, the wheels, the electronics, the breech, all of that can be replaced. You can change a wheel swap, an optic repair, an engine. But there's one part that isn't simply a part. It is the gun, the barrel. The barrel is where all the violence happens. With every shot, an explosion drives a projectile through it at thousands of kilometers an hour under a pressure that pushes steel to its limit. That's exactly why the new Ukrainian munition went after this one part. It isn't built to hit just anywhere. It's built to split the barrel open from the inside. And a split barrel isn't a damaged gun. It's a dead gun. Picture a rifle that explodes in your hands. You don't repair something like that. You throw it away. With a howitzer, you just throw away several tons of steel. Picture the morning after from the Russian side. A battery commander walks up to his guns. No crater next to them, no fire, no dead comrade. At first glance, everything looks normal. Only when he looks closer does he see it. The barrel is torn open, burst like a banana peel, on 3 of his guns, overnight. And he knows at once that no workshop on Earth will fix this. The engine he can repair, the wheels, the optic, but not that. These guns will never fire again. That's exactly the feeling Ukraine wants to create, not the loud bang, but the quiet certainty that something is broken beyond repair. Now comes the point where the story gets really uncomfortable for Russia. These barrels are Russia's sore spot anyway, long before Ukraine started hunting them. A gun barrel doesn't last forever. A good barrel might survive 2,000 to 3,000 rounds, then it's worn out and has to go. A bad barrel bursts after 1,000 rounds or fewer. At the firing intensity of this war, that's not years, that's weeks. Russian military bloggers have long been posting images of guns with burst barrels worn out, not even hit by the enemy, simply fired to death. So Russia is constantly losing barrels, even in normal operation, just from shooting. And now add the firing fury of this war on top. On hot days, Russian artillery hurls tens of thousands of shells toward Ukrainian positions. Every one of those shots gnaws at the steel. Even the best armies in the world struggle to supply their guns with new barrels fast enough, and those are armies without sanctions, with modern factories and free access to every raw material. Russia has none of that. It's fighting a war of attrition, in which, of all things, its most important weapon wears itself out. Ukraine has now simply sped that process up and handed it a switch it can flip at will. And where does Russia get the replacements? Here it gets tight. According to a study by the London-based institute RUSI, in all of Russia, there is only a handful of plants that can produce artillery barrels in series at all above all. Plant number 9 in Yekaterinburg and Titan Barricadi in Volgograd, plus, with limitations, 2 further sites. Picture that for a second. A whole empire of firepower hanging on a handful of chimneys, and producing a single barrel takes not hours and not days. It takes months. And there's one more thing, and it's almost poetic. Inside a good barrel lies a wafer-thin layer of chromium. You can picture it like the non-stick coating in a frying pan. It shields the steel from the heat and extends the barrel's life by 2.5 to 3 times. Without that layer, the fire eats through the steel far faster. And the chromium for it, Russia has to import in large part. Of all things, the material that keeps its guns alive comes from abroad and can be put under pressure with sanctions. That same RUSI analysis also points out that a large share of Russia's manufacturing machinery for these barrels is long outdated, some of it already at the end of its life. In plain terms, even with no Ukrainian munition at all, Russia could barely produce enough barrels to offset ordinary wear alone. The machines are old, the number of plants is small, and a crucial raw material has to cross borders the West can control. Every destroyed barrel, therefore, doesn't land on some big pile of spare parts. It lands right at the top of a waiting list that was already too long. Put it together. Russia had a barrel problem before this operation. They wear out faster than the few factories can resupply, and the material for them partly comes from abroad. And it's exactly into that open wound that Ukraine is now pressing its finger, because that's the whole difference between a destroyed tank and a destroyed barrel. A tank Russia can replace. The plants churn out hundreds a year plus thousands of mothballed older models from Soviet times. A tank loss hurts, but it's replaceable. A destroyed barrel, on the other hand, hits a system that already can barely keep up in normal operation. 250 destroyed barrels aren't 250 guns that need a quick trip to the workshop. They're 250 holes in a bucket that was already leaking. And now comes the calculation that turns the whole thing into a nightmare for Moscow. What is the munition that kills such a barrel cost a fraction of what the barrel itself costs? A comparatively cheap weapon carried to the target by a drone destroys a component that holds months of work and expensive imported material. This isn't a battle in the classic sense anymore. It's a trade. And in that trade, Ukraine gives a coin and takes a gold bar in return. If that trade works and can be repeated, then Russia doesn't lose this war in one big bang. It loses it quietly, barrel by barrel, and that's the real explosive force of this operation. Not the damage of a single night, but the logic behind it. A drone costs a fraction of a gun barrel. You build a drone in hours, a barrel in months. If Ukraine industrializes this equation, many cheap hunters against few expensive, only slowly replaceable targets, then it doesn't have to beat Russia in the classic sense at all. It only has to outlast it. It only has to destroy faster than Russia can rebuild. And the longer this war drags on, the more time itself works against Russian artillery, that same time Moscow always considered its most important ally. That's the detail in Fedorov's words that matters more than the number 250. Not 250 guns are gone, but 250 guns are gone, they can't come back, and they're missing from a system that's already running flat out. That's the difference between a wound and a bleeding out. But now the honest counter question. Does this really break Russian artillery, or does Moscow find a way to adapt? Let's look at the possibilities soberly. There are basically three. The first, the thing works exactly as Kiev hopes. The munition can be mass-produced, and Fedorov hinted in the same interview that in the first 4 months of this year, Ukraine had already procured more drones than in all of last year. If that holds, then Ardoshan isn't a one-off, but the start of a whole campaign. And then Russia's fire superiority slowly begins to shrink, not overnight, but week by week. That's the point where it gets dangerous for the Russian infantry. Those soldiers are used to advancing behind a wall of fire. The artillery goes first, flattens the defense, and only then does the man come. Take that wall away, and suddenly they're walking naked across open ground. That's exactly what Ukraine already did once with Russia's tanks last year. 6 months without a major offensive were the result. Apply that to the artillery, and the picture gets even darker for Moscow. Because fire support isn't just attack, it's also defense. It keeps Ukrainian assault squads at a distance. It covers retreats. It smashes troop concentrations before they become dangerous. If that wall of fire crumbles, Russia loses not only the fist it strikes with, but also the shield it hides behind, at both ends of the front at once. The second possibility, Russia adapts. It pulls the guns farther back, disperses them, camouflages them, better jams the incoming drones with electronic warfare. That costs friction, costs tempo, costs range, but it's no collapse. Russia has adapted many times in this war, usually slower than Ukraine, often only after painful losses, but in the end it did. You should never take an opponent for incapable of learning just because you've caught it off guard, but even adaptation has its price. Guns that stand farther back cover less front. Guns that constantly change position fire less often. Guns hidden under camouflage netting are slower into action. Each of those measures makes Russian artillery a little less effective, and that alone is already half a victory for Kiev. You don't have to destroy a weapon to devalue it. You only have to force it to hide. The third possibility, and we have to say it out loud, the number is exaggerated. Maybe it wasn't 250 permanently destroyed barrels. Maybe part of them were only damaged and are long since rolling again. Maybe 250 is the prettiest reading of an operation that was in truth smaller. In war, the first numbers are almost always the numbers of the side that's looking good. That's not an accusation against Ukraine, that's simply the nature of any frontline report. Now my bet, and I'll say openly, that this is an assessment, not a certainty. I consider the mechanism real. A munition built to split the barrel open fits precisely what independent analysts have been saying for years about Russia's biggest weak spot, that its barrels are the Achilles heel of its firepower. It's too specific and too closely built along a real documented weakness to simply be made up. The exact number 250 I'd treat more carefully. That's probably Kiev's best case, the upper end of the estimate. But the direction is right, and with that, the real war shifts to an invisible place, into a race of production. How fast can Ukraine build these barrel killers against how fast can Russia resupply new barrels? And on that stretch, with only a handful of factories with imported chromium and aging machinery, time runs against Moscow over the months. And this race is treacherous because from the outside you can barely see it. There's no big battle, no date, no turning point to hold on to. It's a curve. On one side, the number of Russian barrels slowly sinking through wear and through operations like this one. On the other side, the number of barrels coming in capped by a few factories and imported metal. As long as the second curve stays below the first, Russia's firepower shrinks no matter what's on the news. And now, the condition that would prove me wrong, because a forecast without an emergency exit is just an assertion. If in the coming weeks, no independent evidence of these destroyed barrel surfaces, no geolocated footage, not a single Russian frontline channel complaining about a wave of burst guns, and if Russian artillery fire on the front doesn't noticeably thin out, then this was no turning point but a clever headline. Don't watch the press release, watch the volume on the front. Because if I'm right, it won't show up in a headline. It'll show up in a silence. On stretches of front, where the Russian fire gets quieter from one week to the next, with no one explaining why. That's the sign. Keep an eye on it, because it would be the first visible proof that Russia's last great advantage is starting to crumble, not through a wonder weapon, but through a small hole in the right piece of steel. And if this kind of breakdown is what you're here for, if you want to understand how quiet decisions like this one tip entire wars, then share this with someone who needs to see it and subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown.